support in this community for a topic that is somewhat of an unspoken topic. It's one of those things that is kind of stealthy unless it's part of your life, and then it's front and center. So this is a lovely opportunity for us to shine some light on, an opportunity for us to create more welcoming, more informed, and more supportive business community and community as a whole. And so it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our three panelists that are going to be having a discussion with us. And I want to encourage you to let you know that this is going to be a back and forth. So if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll go for it. And then we'll allow for questions at the end also. So what I'd like to do is I want to start off with Sheila to my right. Sheila has worked in the human resources field for more than half of her adult life. She has a bachelor's degree from Columbia College, where she majored in business administration and human resource management, and obtained her SPHR certification in 2014. Sheila has proudly spent the last 11 years working for Kat Cunningham of MoreSource, where she serves as the human resource director. Sheila works with multiple well-known local businesses in our community as an HR consultant who wears many hats, specializing in the legal and compliance aspect of human resources such as EEOC, investigators, workers' comp claims, wage and hour issues, and labor law claims. Because Sheila loves the challenge of learning something new, she lists internet research and reading as two of her favorite pastimes. Thank you. And next we have Sarah. Sarah, after a bipolar II diagnosis and many failed attempts at making a traditional job fit her moods, Sarah began exploring how to work despite her illness. She decided to pursue the path of entrepreneurship and the flexibility it could provide. While on this journey, she began writing over at the Beloved Space, where she shared what she was learning about taking care of herself. The love, support, and general interest sparked the idea to take her message of mental stability into the corporate world. While Sarah is not a mental health professional, she has worked with a licensed counselor to create materials for both leaders and employees to take the initiative to create a safe, sustainable, and supportive work and personal life. Outside of her mental health consulting, Sarah is a writer, designer, and co-owner of a content strategy firm with her husband.
He's back there.
He's back there. Excellent. Yeah. And to my far right, we have Heather Grout. She is actually does the marketing for Centerpoint, and we know in the community that Centerpoint Hospital will be opening its doors this fall, and it is an in and outpatient hospital for mental illness and substance abuse. And so we're very grateful to in the community to have that opening up. So thank you all for being here. So what I'd like to do is start off with a definition. You know, what is actually mental illness? And so I'm going to share a definition that NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, uses for mental illness. Mental illness is a condition that affects a person's thinking, feeling, or mood. Such conditions may affect someone's ability to relate to others and function each day. Each person will have different experiences, even people with the same diagnosis. And interestingly enough, we have 1 in 5 adults experience a mental health condition every single year. And so 1 in 17 lives with a serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia or bipolar. So in addition to a person's directly experiencing a mental illness, the family, the friends, the community, and the workplace are all affected. So there is a stigma around the disease, and roughly 85% of mental health conditions are undiagnosed and untreated. So employees really have an opportunity to change this climate of fear regarding mental health at the workplace. So there's plenty of motivation to do this, to make this something where you have a supportive environment, because the mental health conditions cost employers more than $100 billion and 217 million lost workdays every day. So by addressing the mental illness issues in the workplace and investing in mental health care for your workers, it's a win-win for everyone. So when we look at this broad brush, what would you say that are the first steps a company can take to establish a culture of openness and acceptance of mental illness? So I'll start right here with you.
I think the most important thing in establishing, especially with a new employee, is that you establish that level of trust so that they know that they can come to you, talk to you openly. Of course, there's questions we cannot ask in the hiring process, and we wouldn't want to. We wouldn't want to ask the questions that were invasive, but we do want them to feel trusted and that they can trust us first up in the door, so that they know that they can come to your human resource team or their supervisor and open those conversations that's going to lead to assistance for them.
Great. So very first, in the onboarding process. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. What would you share?
Right along the same vein as building that trust. And something I've seen is, so say you really get along with your boss or you really get along well with your employee, that doesn't mean that they know how to come to you, and if they do, you don't know how to respond, and so that creates that uncertainty. So I always encourage businesses to look at the type of environment they have. If it's a more intimate workspace, and small businesses tend to be, looking at that and actually creating steps and a procedure for how to approach those conversations and defining language for them. So these are the things you can come talk about. Here's how you can talk about them, and here's how you will be treated afterwards. Here's what we're going to do with that information. So, building that trust around a structure, so they're not just coming to you crying with, I'm really dealing with something big. They know how they can talk, and they know that their information is safe.
Excellent. And I don't know, but Heather, if you had anything that you wanted to add to that conversation.
Well, the only thing that I would add is the main reason Centerpoint is opening in Columbia is it's important to have local resources. You may only need outpatient services for the person you're working with, and they need to be with their family. And we found that a lot of our clients were having to come from mid-Missouri to St. Louis to get the services, and it took them away from their family and their support. And so we're excited to hopefully make that more local.
Absolutely. Yes, yeah, we were having a discussion earlier when you have a situation where it pops up and someone in your family or you personally have a panic attack or some kind of a nervous breakdown to drive. Now currently you need to drive to St. Louis, and so imagine that 2-hour drive initially, and then your family support. So the immediacy of support will be a lovely thing. So what are resources you would direct our audience to for support around mental illness right now? So if you're an employer and you have a situation, what kind of resources are available? What kind of resources would you suggest our group reach out to?
So I worked at a small business, Veterans United. Are you guys familiar?
A small business.
That's the joke. That's the joke. It's a small one. And so something they did that I think a lot of small businesses can adopt is they actually created like a resource list. They have a little bit, few more resources than most of us do. So they were actually able to create programs where you could get 3 free counseling sessions, but we all don't have those resources. So I always recommend reaching out to counselors in your area and actually finding some that you can send your employees to. So like, oh, you're struggling, here is a list of people you can talk to. So establishing that with your company, and then, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, they have a ton of like ebooks and guides on not just how to talk to people, but the legal ramifications of what you can and cannot say. So there's a lot out there if you just Google it, but I always recommend creating your own resource sheet, like locally. So you could be like Centerpoint, and maybe if you talk to Centerpoint and be like, if I send my employees here, what kind of experience are they going to have, and how can I help, and can I, help financially? So that's what I recommend.
Another resource that we use often is the Job Accommodation Network, askjan.org. It deals mostly with ADA and accommodations of ADA, where many mental health situations are going to fall under that. And I use them very frequently. I'm on the phone with them at least once a week probably, where they will talk you through what is a reasonable accommodation. And so many times they offer solutions that you may not have thought of. So they're very easy to get to. Their website is very accessible and very informative. They have an 800 number. They're very timely about returning phone calls. So they're one of my go-to resources.
Great, thank you for that. So let's say that you have a staff member who runs out of a meeting sweaty, they're having a panic attack. So what kind of structure and flexibility do you find is common? Because I think many times there's the concern as an employer of, if I have this situation, what am I going to have to build a new wing? What am I going to have to do to deal with this? Looking at flexibility, flex time, quiet spaces. What kind of typical experiences do you see as solutions for the business owner when they have a situation with an employee that's dealing with mental illness?
I've seen, and I think it comes down to the type of environment you have. Small businesses have a little bit more freedom. They can be like, take the afternoon off. But I would really recommend looking at your business and looking at the way you handle sick leave. How you handle maternity leave is a big one as well. Looking at how you're handling those and then deciding how you can create that flexibility. We have a lot of veterans in Columbia, and something people, just don't think about if you're not a veteran is how PTSD affects your work environment. So reasonable accommodations is making it so their back's not facing the door. So talking to them, using those resources to get an idea of what is a reasonable accommodation, and just getting creative and talking to the employee. Because if they're having a panic attack, maybe it's, the client they're working with was yelling at them. A reasonable accommodation is maybe they don't have to work with that client. It could be as simple as moving their desk near a window so they have some sunshine. So I think it just kind of comes down to the environment you're working in.
Also, sometimes creating the avenue so that if they don't come into the workplace with an advocate, that we can set them up with an advocate within the environment, so that, we all spend a large part of our waking hours at work. And so if they have someone that they can go to confidentially within their team that's more of a peer than a supervisor or a manager, that they can just say, I'm having trouble. And so you can take a brief walk outside or shut the door quietly or whatever, and just give them that additional few minutes that they need to kind of regroup, so that they don't feel like they're outing themselves and or breaking confidentiality that they would not want to share with management or sometimes the supervisor team.
Yeah, and kind of having somebody to have your back is really important. If maybe you don't want everyone to know you're struggling with anxiety,
Right.
having somebody who's going to cover for you. Like, they're gone right now, you don't need to know about it. I've heard from a lot of people, something they do at their company if someone's having a rough mental health day is they tell people they're dealing with diarrhea. And no one ever asks any follow-up questions. No one's going to say anything. So having that person that will cover for you and kind of take that, so you don't have to, not everyone in the office needs to know that, you have anxiety because it's raining. They don't need to know that.
Sure.
Absolutely. Heather, anything you want to add?
I wish I could add a little bit more. I'm filling in for Buddy Turner, who is our CEO, who's supposed to have been here today, had a death in the family over the weekend. And so I can answer questions about the hospital, but not
Great. Yes.
go into these levels.
And there was a question, yes, ma'am.
My question was, do you have any suggestions for normalizing these kinds of coping avenues, to take a walk outside? Would you say that that's something that's open to not just somebody who's struggling with like a diagnosed anxiety disorder, but someone who's just having a really rough day? I guess, how would you suggest making it clear that those kinds of things are available to everyone taking advantage of?
I normally start with a language for your company. Having been diagnosed with something, I was given the blessing of language for how to discuss what was wrong. I could say I'm depressed, but a lot of people will experience something different. Maybe it's a day, maybe it's 3 years, but especially those who haven't been diagnosed, they don't have a language to describe what the problem is. So saying, if you're having a day where you're feeling a tightness in your chest, go take a walk. Here's an option for you. So just laying out, these are things you could be feeling. You don't have to feel them. Here's some things you can do while you're at work. You can go take your lunch outside. You can go on a walk. You can step into a side room and just kind of have a minute to breathe. It's okay to, this one's kind of strange, but shut your eyes at your desk. that's one that people may look at you funny, but just setting a standard for if you're feeling overwhelmed, you're allowed to shut your eyes at your desk and just kind of take a few deep breaths. So creating that language for them so they can communicate and say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm feeling tightness in my chest, or I'm getting a migraine from stress. Creating that language for them allows them to communicate back to you, and then you can communicate what's available. They just may have no idea.
Well, and to add what you said, normalizing some of those opportunities to just take that break or whatever, you want the environment and the culture in your group to be such that everyone feels it's okay to get up and take that brief walk outside. So that those that need to because of a diagnosis don't feel so on display or obvious to everyone. So that you want to encourage just that culture of creating those opportunities to kind of take that few minute respite and get away. And so, I mean, that's going to keep those that may have a diagnosis and may be struggling with how to communicate that to others, that they don't feel that they suddenly turn purple and they're neon so that everybody knows they're having a crisis. So it's creating a culture that everyone knows they have that opportunity.
And as a leader, if you feel comfortable sharing steps you're taking, that'll make your employees feel more comfortable. I had a group of employees for a period of time, and I would freely say, I have counseling this afternoon with my counselor, I'll be out today. And just kind of normalized it. They're like, well, my manager seems to have it together, and she goes to counseling, so I could go to counseling. Sure. And once I kind of started having those open conversations, more people were, hey, who's your counselor, and can I go? So setting those examples of normalizing it, like I can guarantee almost everyone here has either experienced it or knows someone who's experienced it. So just set those expectations of what you're already doing.
Okay, so what are some of the vulnerabilities as a company that you have that you would want to be aware of? Like maybe some lawsuits that have happened recently, things that owners right now, it's really important for them to know as they develop this culture.
I'm going to make you go first.
You're going to go first. The one thing that I often say to people when coaching different clients is that you don't want to set a negative precedent for singling someone out and giving them exceptional accommodations that you may not be able to or willing to do for someone else. So you kind of have to tip that balance into being cautious. You want to do for one what you're going to do for everyone. Under ADA, accommodations have to be reasonable and necessary. What's reasonable to one may not be reasonable to another. So you want to be willing to accommodate what their specific needs are, and still know that you're going to have to do it for everyone equally to the same extent, maybe not identical accommodations, but you have to be willing to paint it with a broad brush and create those opportunities for everyone to take advantage of.
I urge leaders in a company to actually put together a script for leaders to reference when they have somebody come express a concern. Empathy isn't a bone we all have, or it's a muscle we all feel is strong. Because I was sitting in a training with some leaders and I was just casually mentioning some things they could say, and they were all furiously writing them down. And I was like, oh, do you guys, I can type this up for you. There's a huge need for knowing exactly what to say and how to say it. Right, and what not to say, and some warnings, because naturally we all want to help. We all know that, but we may not do it super well. We may just not be experienced in it. I had a boss who so desperately wanted to help me when I came forward with depression. He actually ended up donating money to depression research and sent me the receipt. And he was like, I don't know what else to do. I hope you know I care, is really what it came down to. So like do's and don'ts very clearly. Like, don't say tough it out. Don't say go home and figure this out. Don't say, don't tell anybody. But just creating that really, really clear method of having those conversations is, I think I'm just going to keep saying this over and over again, but creating a script even. Just like, here's something you could say. Here's how you follow that. Makes things a lot easier.
So how, like, as a small business owner, I feel like the day-to-day tasks that you're just constantly like on the move, that to an employee, I almost look like I'm not open for them to come to me. How do I make it look like I'm ready to listen to what they have to say, but I'm still like busy in my day-to-day? Like, I don't want to look like, oh shoot, I should bother with that
Yeah.
now.
I, even from a business standpoint, recommend like regular one-on-ones with everyone you work with. It's super hard to do, and I get that, especially to find the time as a small business owner. But just creating the space to talk about that is so important, even if it's 5 minutes you meet every Friday, and just saying, okay, so how's work? Talk through work. Do you need anything from me? And also, how are you? And is there anything you need from me, not work related? How are things? You don't have to talk, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. Just want you to know I'm open, I'm here, and I want to make sure you're the best human that you can possibly be.
So, research also shows that the higher up you are in an organization, many times the higher your stress level is. And that stress is a factor in mental illness onsets. So what do you say with regards to leaders in a role that are struggling with mental illness, anxiety disorders, and things like that, when it's not necessarily the staff, but it's the leaders?
First of all, you do not have to have an anxiety disorder to have anxiety. It's a very normal human condition. It doesn't mean you should live that way and you should just resign to the fact that you're always going to feel like crap. But you don't have to go to a counselor and be diagnosed with it to start finding solutions. The reason we pay CEOs tons of money is because they are dealing with overwhelming, stress. I feel like who here has an employee, somebody they're responsible for their livelihood? That is so overwhelming. And regularly processing that weight is so important. Otherwise, you will become a terrible leader just because you will lack the capacity to care for others because you yourself are falling apart. Was that scary? I'm sorry. You're not falling apart. I'm sorry. You'll be great.
But as a leader, in setting the culture, again, in setting the environment that you want your staff to be comfortable in, you have to be willing to take those steps yourself, to sometimes take that downtime, the me time, whatever, even if it's just walking away. And so in order to encourage your staff and your subordinates to do that, you have to be able to do that yourself. So as leaders, everyone has to be aware, too, of what their breaking point is and take action before they get there.
Yeah, and you guys are still human. Just because you're responsible for other people doesn't mean you're somehow less of an emotional, mushy human being inside. So treat yourself. I always tell people to treat yourself like you treat a child. Like, take care of yourself. Put yourself down for naps if you need it. Give yourself a snack if you're grumpy.
There you go.
It sounds silly, but it helps me wrap my mind around it when I can tell I'm stressed. If my child, I don't have a child, if a child was acting this way, what would I do with them? I'm like, they're overstimulated. It's time to sit down and be quiet. Treat yourself that way. It's like a cheat. That's how you know.
So what are some tips you would offer for reintegrating an employee back into the workplace after an extended absence for treatment? And what role should staff play in that process?
Well, this is where I feel like I'm an expert. I actually just disappeared for work for 3 days. We did not have resources at the time, and I actually checked myself into the emergency room for suicidal thoughts. Guys, I'm going to be real honest with you. So I was checked in, and I had tried to get my friends to call my boss, but they couldn't get a hold of him, so I just didn't show up to work for 3 days, right? And I didn't know what for them to, so my friend was reaching out to my employees, and like, Sarah's sick. She didn't know what to tell them. I could make very few phone calls. I don't know if you guys have ever been institutionalized, but it's essentially prison. It's brain prison. You can't do anything. So when I got back, I was just overwhelmed so I just dealt with a lot of stress. I spent 3 days in a hold. And then you get out, and I have all these emails coming in. Where are you? Where have you been? Are you dead? And what do I tell people where I've been? I concocted a story with a nurse friend that I had a migraine and then kidney infection. I don't know. I came up with a lot of things. So I lied to all my coworkers, and then I ended up meeting with someone in HR, and I was like, what do I do? What do I tell my boss? I don't want them to know I was lying, but I also don't want them to think that, I'm not a competent manager. Just because I had a breakdown does not mean that I don't know how to do my job. And he encouraged me to be honest with my boss and tell him I was lying to other people, and for him to have my back. Which was an interesting conversation, to be like, hey, I'm lying to a lot of people. If they find out, will you back me up? And he was like, absolutely, that's totally fine. So reintegrating back into it, his response was, well, what do you need? I ended up doing half days for the next week. I didn't tell anyone why. I was like, I'm taking half days for the next week. Most of the time, people won't ask if you're just like, I'm doing this. they'll leave you alone. So I did half days, and then I ended up taking a full week off and then did half days again. Or I would just do mornings or just do afternoons. So he was very flexible, and not everyone has that flexibility. But there's a lot of creative ways with moms coming back into the workforce. They're going to be leaving for their kids. They just are. Their life's now different. So reintegrating them and letting them know that it's okay if they need to come in late because their kid threw up all over their shirt. Just setting that precedent for it's going to be okay.
Well, and I think having those conversations, again, going back to culture, but I think culture is so important from the very onset of how our staff see us or how our supervisors see us or whatever. And so, as Sarah said, talking about creating that script early on and then knowing what the person, the employee, wants you to discuss or doesn't want you to discuss. So you need to know up front what conversations you're going to have with staff, because coworkers are going to ask out of concern, is she okay? They're going to want to know information. There's limits to what you can and should share, of course. And so it's creating those opportunities early on to know what you're going to do in case a crisis happens.
Yeah, and having a good grasp on all the different ways you can accommodate. So say I came into your office and you were like, yeah, take a month off. And then another employee was like, hey, can I also take a month off? And you're like, crap, that was not a good accommodation. And you mentioned this earlier, that was not a good accommodation. So just kind of reviewing what's possible, and yeah, coming up with what are you going to say to the other employees when this one person seems to be getting special treatment? Creating that language and creating that expectation that, like, it's not always your business.
Exactly.
It's not all about you. Unfortunately, this person needs this. So,
And part of that accommodation is when Centerpoint opens, we're going to, before we start having clients, have open houses so that you can come and tour the facility and actually see what does a mental hospital facility look like, because we have these movie version ideas and then what is actually reality. And this setting is very much home-like, and it will help you better understand.
I'm jealous. Mine was not home-like.
That's what we're hoping.
I'm very, guys, this is a big deal.
This will be very
Big deal.
home-like. It's very different from what I think you'll think it is, and I think that will also help you understand what somebody in your office place might be going through and where they
Yeah.
might be.
No, yeah, that's a good point, because my boss was like, I have no idea what you just did. And I was like, it was like prison. And he was like, but it is. It is like prison, especially if you're in the hospital. And interestingly enough, they put you with everybody with mental illness, which is a wide range. So guys, just be so thankful this is coming, because it's a rough experience for people. And knowing that you can send them someplace and you can have an idea of what they're actually experiencing makes the conversation a lot easier.
We have a better understanding of that. We are going to divide by age groups at Centerpoint. There'll be adolescent, adult, and then seniors. We'll have in-house and then also out-of-house care, so that somebody might come in for a 3-day hold and then get graduated to only coming in during the day and going home at night, to just coming to sessions. And so having an understanding of your worker maybe at this stage of their treatment will be, I think, critical. to
Yeah, that
accommodation.
communication.
Yep.
I had a question about, we're talking about language, about what to tell the other employees about that. So as an owner, when you know something about an employee, but you need to share something with your management team, what's appropriate to share and what's not appropriate? So if the management kind of knows what's going on, but like doesn't ask about, it's not their business, basically.
So if you couldn't hear, the question is, what is appropriate to share so that you have some openness and communication, but you also are keeping the privacy in place? So what is it you can share? How do you handle that?
I'll let you talk to this, but overall I would say tell your employees this person's having a personal problem or a family problem, and then tell them what they can do to help. Because if you don't tell them what they can do to help, they're going to start harassing this person with, like, I hope you're okay, I hope nobody died, what happened? There's those nosy people that want to know. Say, hey, this person's not doing well, feel free to, give them a hug, or feel free to send me any thoughts, and then I'll give them to this person. But for the most part, they'd like some privacy. And because whatever's going on could be a range of things, do not go into specifics unless that person, for some reason, really wants everyone to know their business. But just set a precedent for this is how you will and will not respond to this person who's going through a personal problem.
Well, and to add to that, sometimes the more vague you are, the more questions it will prompt. And so you want to have that response that says, Sarah's not feeling well, she's going to be out for a couple days, or Sarah has a situation going on at home. So make it generic so that you're sharing information, and if you have questions, please see your supervisor. Something so simple as giving them direction on who to ask. Many people that just want to be nosy are not going to go to their supervisor and say, what's going on with her? You know, they're going to realize that it's an issue of discretion, that you have to be quiet or confidential or whatever. And usually people in work environments are very receptive to the fact that I can ask about this, I can't ask about that, or I can discuss it. They pick up very quickly on whether or not there are issues that just shouldn't be discussed and that you don't need to know. I think that getting our staff in the habit of having those conversations, so that if they are curious enough that they're going to ask, that they're going to go to the appropriate person and not just be, you know, twittering amongst their coworkers or whatever.
I mean, they're probably going to Twitter, no matter what you do, but you can try to keep it at a minimum. And I've seen, and this isn't so mental health related, but I had a fellow employee who had a death in the family, and the last thing she needed in that moment was a million text messages asking what happened, and telling them that we're here for you. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever had, you know, a trauma, but all those text messages just make you feel like you've got more on your plate. So giving them an avenue to then help that person, like, we have a card you can come sign. That's going to be about what all you're going to do, so on and so forth. You have a question?
It sounds like a lot of what you're advising is to anticipate situations ahead of time and then decide how you're going to respond, because it's hard to come up with that on the fly. Are there any particular situations that you see coming up that you think employers need to be particularly aware of in terms of anticipating and coming up with a thoughtful response?
The biggest one I want all of you to take and put in your brains doesn't even just apply to employees. It is when somebody in your life in front of you is talking about hurting themselves or others. That is one of the scariest situations, and in those moments, knowing what to do is actually life or death. And it puts so much weight on the person who just received the information. For example, I've heard of employees coming in to their boss's office and just being like, I don't see what the point of life is anymore, just kind of alluding to wanting to hurt themselves. In those moments, there should be a very clear way to respond. That's a big thing I advocate, is the way you should respond is, one, do you have a plan to hurt yourself? If it's yes, ask to take them. If it's yes and they don't want to go someplace, you can actually call 911. Columbia has an exceptional police force that's specifically trained to do home checks, and they will take over the burden for you. If the employee or friend or family member says, no, I don't have a plan, there's a whole other list of, and I can send you guys this if you're interested, and a whole other list of dialogues you can have that encourage them to get help, and also help you process what just happened and what your responsibility and what your role in that conversation really is. I recommend everybody anticipate that this might happen at some point in your life. I've had this conversation with groups, and afterwards I have at least 2 people come up and say they've had a friend either take their own lives or almost take their own lives, and they've had to deal with that. Anticipate that this will happen. Dear God, we hope it won't. But just know it's not your responsibility. They're sick. If someone had a broken leg, what would you do? Take them to the hospital. Treat it just like that. And I always urge people, life is more important than your relationship with that person. And if you think you're going to embarrass them, get over yourself. Your relationship is not as important as them staying alive.
How about for those employees that don't show any emotion? Just like,
What do you mean?
like, how was your day? Fine. How are you feeling? Good?
In that situation, I would create a space to ask them if they're doing okay, but you can't pull that out of them. Don't put that on yourself. And if they do something that's not on you, they made that decision. You can't go around pulling mental illness problems out of people. And if you do, I mean, you're opening yourself up for a big problem.
Like, you know, like something's happened in their life, like this, I'm talking about, I know something has been happening, so you're asking them, and they're just like, what?
That's their prerogative. You can be like, hey, I'm here for you, but you can't pull that out of them, unfortunately. I mean, as much as I'd love to walk around being like, what are our feelings? You can't do that to people.
Right.
I think one thing important from the employer's perspective is that as we're interviewing people and or onboarding new hires into a company, we always hear the question being asked, can you do this job with or without accommodations? I think that needs to be a true conversation without going into too much depth, but we don't want to just flippantly ask, can you do this job with or without accommodations, and move on to, and what's your street address and whatever. And I've seen it happen. I have seen people onboard that way, to where they're asking the question and they can say, oh, I asked, but not really caring about the answer or taking time to hear that answer or have that conversation back and forth. So I think, to me, that's one of the most important aspects of recruiting and or hiring, is that you're actually looking someone in the eye when you say, and can you do this job with or without accommodations? You're opening the door for them to give you details that they may not otherwise have been comfortable doing. So from the very onset, they need to know that they need to be able to talk to you, and much less in a situation of a crisis, that they know that they can actually trigger those conversations.
Telling them what like that could look like, an accommodation could look like just even for, because for me, if I heard that question, I'd be like, yeah, I'm awesome. Kind of telling them, like, this is so we've had some people do this kind of accommodation. Are you okay with this part? Especially if your job has more stressful components, like letting them know, like, this is going to be kind of stressful. These are some areas. I mean, I don't know if you necessarily want to set a precedent for everyone coming in with just willy-nilly accommodations, but explaining to them what that is so they even know how to answer that question.
What's the best way to approach, or what kind of sensitivities can be developed when you suspect there might be a problem, but the employee doesn't come to you, or might even where that they're dealing with some sort of dysfunction, and it might even be impacting the workplace, their work, the work of others. Then, what are some avenues and ways to address that from the supervisor's perspective?
I used when I was a manager, now I just work with my husband, so I don't get the glory of being a manager anymore, but I actually had a worksheet that I would sit down with my employees, and how this worksheet worked is I would just ask a series of questions that would help them uncover any area they're lacking as an employee. So for example, say you have an employee that's underperforming and you assume it's because they're a new dad. But you can't go like, you're underperforming and I think it's because you're a new dad. That's inappropriate. But what you can do is sit down and be like, hey, I just want to talk to you about how you feel like you're doing. And having, and I can share this with you guys if you'd like, I always enjoy doing it because you ask questions and they slowly are answering them themselves and coming to a realization that maybe I'm not doing so great, and helping them kind of create a plan on their own. And so all you do is shut your mouth hole and just let them answer, and you'll be surprised what employees will come up with. And from there, I always recommend documenting, and I'd love your insight on this, documenting when people tell you they're dealing with things and warnings you've given them, like, hey, you're underperforming, and here's an accommodation I think we should look into. So if they do continue to underperform, you don't want to be dealing with an employee who doesn't want to get help, doesn't want to get better, and is, sucking on your time as a company. You can run into issues there if you do decide to terminate that employee and they've expressed a mental illness. That's where a lot of lawsuits are happening, is they're like, they fired me because I had postpartum depression. Sometimes they do, and you need to protect yourself against that. And to just, help the employee. But more importantly, if your employee is underperforming, that's an issue. You should accommodate, but if they're not willing to improve, you need to take the next steps.
And to add to that, ADA accommodations, we've all heard the trigger phrase, reasonable and necessary. Reasonable accommodations don't necessarily cover disciplinary issues. So if there are concerns in performance, you've got to coach them up quickly, coach them up appropriately, and document them so that if they do progress to a full-blown ADA protected issue, that you can at least say, okay, it was a performance concern first and then the ADA issue arose, or vice versa. The ADA should come along and now we've got a performance concern. It impacts the entire process going forward. So we always say hire slow, fire fast. You also want to make sure that you're hiring thoroughly so that you're having conversations up front and that you are documenting concerns quickly. You're not just brushing them under the rug.
Yeah, document. I just want to tell you guys a horror story I experienced in my own life. My sister worked in adoptions, and she told her manager she was dealing with postpartum depression. Her manager went then and emailed all the other leadership and was talking about her. and how they think she's underperforming, and they're asking each other if there's a way they could get her to quit on her own. And then they forwarded that email to my sister. She had every right to sue them. She didn't. Oh, it breaks my heart. But those are things that happen that you don't think are going to happen, and they did eventually force her out by giving her an extended workload. So these things happen. You guys will never do that, so that's great. But documenting that, they did not protect themselves. If my sister was a meaner person, they could have been in a lot of trouble. So document early, often. Keep track of everything. If you're having a conversation where a reasonable accommodation has happened, document it. Keep all of that together.
Going back to what you guys were talking about earlier, what would you say is the appropriate, maybe professional from a management perspective, but then also a personal reaction to, say, like somebody you manage directly or somebody you know doesn't show up for work? I think some of us probably dealt with that in business, and then also, with friends and life. So what is, I guess, the two separate questions a little bit. What is appropriate, what are appropriate actions to take in those scenarios where you can't control somebody?
My first go-to would be to utilize your emergency contact information that you gathered upon hire. It's better to not check on, I'm sorry, that's wrong. It's better to check on someone and upset your employee so that they know that you cared enough to at least check on them if they didn't show up for a day and they called in. You're opening that door so that perhaps mom or spouse or whoever can say, yeah, she's not feeling well today. You at least know that they're not laying at home needing medical attention, and that they didn't reach out to anyone. We've encountered that recently through MoreSource, where we knew that someone was struggling, and we knew they didn't feel well, they didn't show up for work, so we waited all day waiting to check on them because we didn't want to infringe on their privacy, and then come to find out there was something very wrong, that we could have been proactive and taken steps to help them much earlier. So I would much rather have an employee say, man, I really wish you hadn't called my husband, or I really wish you hadn't called mom and worried them, than to have them say, I wish you'd called sooner. So utilize your emergency contact forms, gather that information up front, and make sure that if you don't hear from somebody that's always very timely and always on time, or calls in if they're not going to be there, if they don't show up, assume that they need help in some way and reach out to them.
Yep, safety over relationships.
One last question here, David.
So in the workplace, we're talking about employees, but we also have customers,
Ooh.
suppliers, people that come into the environment. Is there other pieces of advice that you would give us in dealing with customers or suppliers that have sensitivities as well?
I haven't thought about that one.
That's a difficult one, because
Yeah.
you have to be careful, one, in sharing information, but you want to be proactive. You want to treat everyone as a friend and be observant if they're needing help. But as far as reaching out, I don't know how you would do that as easily as you would with an employee. I mean, our staff becomes part of our family, essentially.
Yeah, I would look at the way you handle those relationships, because they can evolve into friendships, and suddenly you have, I've seen it happen where you go out drinking or you go to a happy hour, and suddenly you find out that this person you've been taking out to drinks is an alcoholic. That's a big problem. I've seen a lot of companies do happy hours, and they don't realize they're excluding somebody or they're enabling an addiction. I mean, guys, this is just, it's hard stuff. And so if you're dealing with a client or a supplier that is struggling, you can have those same conversations and say, are you okay? And if it is something that's affecting your work and they've come forward and told you, I would just document. If they say, I'm missing these orders because of, I'm dealing with a personal issue, that's going to be on you to talk with them about, okay, but I still need my business to function. So here's what I can do for you. But at this point, you need to let me know when you can no longer fulfill, our contracted duties. Does that answer your question? It's hard. I'm not going to tell you there's some easy way to handle this, but because it's a mix of people and medical issues and business. And you bring all those together, you guys.
All righty. Well, I think that wraps it up. I'd like to thank Heather and Sarah and Sheila for sharing their expertise and their openness, and the support of everyone here and being in a community that's so open and supportive to these kind of issues. So we're going to close it down, and I'm sure if you have questions, they will be here to answer those for you.